We're just like looking at the light on the fabric, but it was the sort of pleasure of like seeing the thing come together. That moment of beginning to see the shape emerge is like the most exciting.
Welcome, friends. I'm Kristen Martin, and this is Torches. Today we have the ingenious Normandy Sherwood. Normandy is an award-winning writer, director, and designer of costumes, objects, and scenery. I'm really excited to speak with her today. Welcome, Normandy.
Thank you for having me, Kristen. It's exciting.
Thanks for doing it. So, how'd you come to be in downtown performance?
Let's see. The short story is that I moved to New York to go to college, and I was really interested in performance art, like 70s body art. And so that made me want to intern at a lot of different cultural institutions. So I was at a place called Exit Art for a while. And then I heard about this place called Shishama and decided to be an intern there one summer. And the person who sort of hired me also was involved in a company called the National Theater of the United States of America. And they were kind of like, oh, and by the way, you can work with our company too. And I was maybe a sophomore in college, and it sort of shifted the trajectory of what I thought I was going to do, because I was so like enchanted by the work that company was making and the community around the company that I kind of ran away and joined the circus a little bit with them. And finished college and then spent the next 4 or more years than that, but at least the next 4 just really only working with that company as a member and a writer, designer, collaborator.
And did you come to it as a playwright originally, or did you come in how did you come in the door to theater?
Well, I had done a lot of like dance, like modern dance when I was younger, and I had made costumes, and I always wrote, but I didn't really think about writing for performance until I was actually working with this company. And it was a pretty collaborative group. So lots of people did a lot of different kinds of things, and most people were doing more than one sort of production area at a time. And it sort of felt like everyone pitch in. So like, well, I can write a little bit. I'd like to contribute to that part. Or
right.
I started doing costumes actually because it seemed like every other design sort of department was in-house. And we kept like hiring a costume designer. And at a certain point I was like, well, I could probably do that. So I'm going to see if I can take that on.
Right. And then after a certain number of years, you decided to go to grad school, and you went and you studied with Mac at Brooklyn College as a playwright. And so then how have you married the work you do as a playwright with your design work? Or do you think of them as separate things?
I mean, I think of them as very related. Like I'm always thinking about how it looks, or like what the sort of physical conditions of the performance are while I'm writing. Like it's very hard for me to not think about that. And, I think I've always been really interested in like the way that like language and visual art and performance interact, and like the interesting ways that they kind of like pull away from each other and also can coexist. And also have really been interested in the ways that like language can like inform things that are visual in ways that aren't explicit. And so like the understructure of like language and description as it relates to like how you embody or create something based on those ideas.
And you've always had a very heightened aesthetic. Like NTUSA had a very heightened, highly designed world that you would enter into in those shows, but at the same time it had a real DIY quality. And I feel like you've carried that into your own practice. Could you talk a bit about what intrigues you about the DIY aesthetic?
I think it's really that I just want to have sort of control of the means of production. First of all, that I just really, when I have an impulse or a vision for like creating a space or a world, I kind of just want to be able to do it. And I feel frustrated with the kind of delays that might come from needing to bring in institutional support or needing to bring in different things. Like I've always just sort of wanted to deeply understand how things work also, so that I can like have better ideas about them. So like, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's always been sort of the point of departure is like, well, what could I make with that and how could I do it? And in a way, I think it's just been like, I've reflected on a lot over the years, but I think in terms of the impulse, it's just been like how I saw how to make things.
Yeah. And you also, I think, have pulled from a lot of different sources in your work. Can you talk about inspirations that have come from non-theatrical sources, whether that's books or music or politics or, yeah.
I guess I would say like in terms of design and like costume design, like I was always sort of a, you know, obsessed with historical garments and how they were constructed and wanting to like figure out how to recreate things. And so like that study or just sort of like thing I found like delicious sort of made its way in. And like I think particularly like the idea of like seeing how something is made and having that how come into the work. Like I kind of locate that in like learning, teaching myself how to sew and kind of like proceeding from these historical garments or my interest in them, and like the feeling of like a pattern coming together is something I really associate with the work of making performance. So that, yeah, it's sort of a sideways influence.
I definitely feel like I saw that in Psychic Self-Defense. Would you talk a little bit about that show and how specifically you think that relates to what you were just talking about?
Yeah, so Psychic Self-Defense is a show that I did as a part of the HARP residency, where I worked closely with Kristen. And the sort of the impulse of that show came from a bit of a joke that I had with myself and my collaborators in some previous processes, which was just that I loved curtains and I always wanted to have a lot of curtains. And it was like, next show I make, it's going to be all curtains, like at least 45 minutes of curtains opening. And so then it was sort of the challenge of like how to, well, can we do that? And like, what would that do? And like, why do that? And sort of like, what's the thing that a visual experience like that could open up? But most of that show was made sort of during pandemic times. And so I was at a point in my life where I had a lot of time to make, actually, to sew. And like, I guess to the second part of your question, like I was just sewing curtains for a really long time, and like the materials that I had available, lots of materials for the arts, and the sort of different
Materials for the Arts is an organization in New York City that gives free things to artists that are donated from companies and individuals.
Yeah, I mean, and I think my work would not exist without Materials for the Arts. I think I'm a
Shout
power
out.
user. But yeah, that I would just be sort of like messing around with some fabric and making different things and sort of seeing what I could make out of the stuff I had, and that a lot of the show, the visual word of the show proceeded from that, like mucking around with available materials and like with a sort of sense of like, this is how I want them to move, or like this is sort of the way I think that some different ways these curtains can interact with each other, creating all the different elements and then like seeing them come together, or like playing with the configuration of how they come together, I think was one of the pleasures of that process.
Could you talk about content and how you think about content in your work?
Yeah, Psychic Self-Defense, as I said, we had this curtain idea, but the other place that it was coming from was just an interest in this like 1930s occult self-help manual called Psychic Self-Defense, which my like that specific text, that it's like my for a while I was trying to write based on that text or like with that text, and throughout that process I just kept feeling like any language is sort of like pulling away from what I want this piece to be. And in a way it's sort of like that was helping me discover like what the content of the piece was.
Yeah.
So like as a general thing I'll say, it's like I feel like content will come from materials and form a lot of time. I mean, there are things that I'm interested in and probably things I see, but like that I want to sort of discover like, what is this a good container for? But with Psychic Self-Defense, it's like this concern with the occult and with sort of like get mysticism, or like getting to a new sort of like consciousness perception is sort of what I ended up taking from that text, rather than, you know, the instructions about how to avoid ghosts and vampires. And that felt really most aligned with like the visual thing that I was making, that it was about like having a visual experience that sort of like does something different to your attention or consciousness.
And how do you think about the relationship with the audience and the type of spaces that you might present your work in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like I always am thinking about like what the audience's experience will be, and like what the space sort of the way that I'm working with the space to like allow them to have a particular kind of experience. And I mean, it's like I've worked both in theaters and in like non-traditional spaces, and you're kind of like always dealing with like, what do you think people's expectations will be coming in? What's fun about working with that or subverting it, and thinking about like creating like whatever the sort of content of the piece is, even if it is something that can be more eerie or unsettling, that it's about sort of like inviting the audience into a really specific place that sort of like there's a level of like pleasure or comfort in being in that space that like kind of allows them to go with wherever else you want to take them. But I think it's like depends. It's like the space is really important, and like how you are treating, or how I would want to treat the space, or like invite people into a space, is like one of the main things I'm thinking about in terms of like actually making a show. Like this last piece that I did, or a show I did at Exponential this year called The Mushroom with Nikki Kalange.
Which was so fun.
Yeah, Kristen
And
got to see it.
quirky and odd. And
But like, we had a lot of ideas bouncing around about that show. There was some text, there was some movement ideas, and it wasn't until we were like, this is the space we're going to try and do a version of this at, that a lot of things sort of crystallized in terms of like, what is the thing we're creating for audiences, and like how are we leading them to the little bits and pieces that we've begun to develop about this.
Did you know that you wanted to do it up in the rehearsal space instead of in the theater, the bulk of the show? Or was that discovered as you were working?
We sort of knew ahead of time, in that like the work that we'd done on it up until the point where we were making that decision, it felt like it needs to be in a small space. Like it needs to be.
There was an intimacy to what you were doing. Yeah.
Totally. Like that, we were like, that part needs to be really contained. And I think we went back and forth a little bit, because that downstairs space at the Target Margin Doxy Theater is so big and beautiful, and like, why wouldn't you want to work with that? But it really felt like, well, but that, we basically, instead of choosing one or the other, we told them we actually really want to use both spaces, because that is the experience we want to create. But yeah, but that
and the stairs,
and the stairs
as
yes,
well.
That it would include a journey through the building. But I think that like the thinking about the possibilities of that space clarified for us like what the piece was even going to be.
Right. Yeah, I loved the contrast of when you were downstairs, that it felt so open and it's just one performer that you're intimately engaged with, but in this voluminous space. And then we're in this tiny space really close to each other with all these large objects and people and shapes and creatures. So I loved, and it felt so like cocooned. So I love the contrast and the experience of the two spaces. Yeah. How do you balance experimentation with craft?
Well, I guess like when I think of craft, I think of like building a repertoire in a certain way, that it's like, if I think of it in terms of like making things, costumes or objects or scenic stuff, that it's like there are materials that I've become familiar with, and like I'll know certain ways I could work with those materials, or I have, or like possibilities I've thought of and I haven't. So I have that sort of like pool of things to think about. And then, and then there's like the idea of like, well, what don't you know, or like what does the occasion call for, that's like beyond your bag of tricks, or like that's like pushing in a different way. So I guess, I mean, I think that it's like, in a certain way, like, how do I want to phrase this? There's something that can happen when you're really new to a discipline, where you have, I mean, I guess some might say it's like beginner's luck, but I don't really think of it that way. It's like you have a beginner's mind, where you're like, you see all of the different materials and you don't know the right way to use them. And so then you can sometimes use them in a really interesting way. Like,
because you don't know what you're supposed to do.
You don't know what you're supposed to do. And like, especially if you have some sort of other thing that you're drawing on, you might be able to really, like come up with a surprising and interesting way to do that. Like the more experience you have with a set of materials or with a medium, the more you're sort of like, the deeper you're going with like what the possibilities are and how something could work most efficiently or best, or like making choices about that. But you're also sort of like, you have to like remind yourself to forget that stuff sometimes in order to be able to get to someplace new. Like if you I mean, I think maybe that's just, again, another shout out to Materials for the Arts. Another reason I love that resource is just that it's like constantly presenting me with new things and materials to like contend with and think about what to do with. And like for me, that's like the challenge that is the most fun is like, here are the things I have to make something out of. So like, what could I make? And like, you know, that having that be sort of the basis of creating something that from that platform, I'm then like, well, okay, well then I want to bring in this and then I want to bring in that, but having it be a little bit of this constraint of the materials available, I think has been so, yeah, I mean, I think that that's sort of like, I hold to that because I think it makes me have to experiment. But that question is funny. It makes me think about like, this is from long ago with NTUSA. At a certain point, we had this funny moment where, you know, we'd been making all of the sets, all of the stuff ourselves. And, you know, it sort of bore the mark of that for a while. And then there was a particular show where someone, I think, asked, like, where did you rent that backdrop or something? And it was like, oh, the craft has gotten so, you know, has gotten to such a point where it isn't like the grain or something, or like the mark of the handmade is not so apparent as it once was.
Right.
And so like that was, it's like, that's an interesting moment to me, is like, what are the choices you're making around like allowing something to be like messy or have that sort of seams showing mark in order to like really expose the labor. Like to me that's really important, is that it's like that helps people see that like a person made this,
Yes,
and like spent their time making a thing. And it's like to do anything to disrupt like a seamlessness you might have of like, well, that's just a thing and it's, you're just consuming it without thinking about who made it. Like that feels important to me kind of ethically to like
yes.
keep messiness in the mix.
Could you describe a moment of pure joy in one of your projects?
Yeah, I mean, many moments in psychic self-defense. One that comes to mind immediately is, so when we were moving toward the full production, we had sort of a long tech period, and we'd be there long days, long nights. And I just remember one night being in the theater with the lighting designer, Christina Tang, kind of late into the night. And we had some questions about the end of the show, but we really just were like looking at lights on this fabric for like hours. And that's something we did throughout that process. And it was
Right.
just sort of like in a way it would feel like, what are we even doing in these moments? We're just like looking at the light on the fabric, but it was sort of a meditative, also clarifying about what we wanted to do. But really more than that, it was like, this is the sort of pleasure of like seeing the thing come together. I feel like that in tech processes a lot, like that moment of beginning to see the shape emerge is like the most exciting moment for me. And like even in just like making a garment, like the moment where you just first start stitching things together and you're like, aha, it looks like a coat or whatever, is like the really exciting moment. And then like you
Right.
finish it and you do whatever with it, but that like that moment of coming together, I think is like most pleasurable for me.
Collaboration is obviously a really big part of your work on your own projects that you're generating with a group of people. You have a lot of people that you work with repeatedly. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what makes a collaboration really generative for you, and also what you learn from being able to work with people again and again.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the one thing I really valued in that work I did with NTUSA earlier on is that the sort of aesthetic of that company and the concerns of that company became so like clear and developed and evolved that there was a way that you kind of would have almost like an egoless, like, well, that would be good for what this thing we're doing. Like it almost existed as an entity outside of the individuals in ways that were freeing and also frustrating, obviously, but like, but that it just sort of felt like, well, that was a great thing about it, is that you're like, it's like a bigger than one person impulse. And to feel like you're contributing to that, but also you're sort of like, you know, able to have some separation from that was like
Right.
what made those processes successful. Um, but I think like on another layer, to answer a different part of the question, like we build a shorthand with people, like collaborators you work with again and again, and like you have a sense of like what they want to do, what they tend to do, and trust of like if people want to do something different, like
Mm-hmm.
sort of opening that up. Like, I mean, a great thing about this recent project, The Mushroom, is that like I've worked with Nikki a lot as a performer and in different ways, and this is the first time we're like kind of co-leads of a project, and that has been such a fun movement and shift in our collaboration and way of sort of thinking about like what, so with the two of us, like what is it that we make together, and
Right.
I feel like it's like surprised me in ways that are exciting.
Great. How has or has your identity and or lived experience shaped your aesthetic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like, way one way I think is just like being socialized as a woman, like
Mm-hmm.
this attention toward like care and like care for community and like, I mean, even just sort of like domestic crafts, I think has like that's just been so central to my work in ways that
Mm-hmm.
are like by choice, but also maybe just sort of like what I'm accustomed to, comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Or societal
or societal
expectations,
expectations. I mean,
right?
yeah, like I think that a sense of like what kind of room I want to create is really patterned by expectations about how women ought to behave in a room and like different ways and ways of leading in that way. And so it's like I felt like value in that and also limitation in that.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I mean, I also think about like just in terms of like in a micro sense, like the family I grew up in, which was very, in certain ways, really arts focused, but in other ways, very casual about that. And like no one had a career in the arts really. I mean, like
Mm-hmm.
in terms of a public career, but my both of my parents and my sister are very kind of like committed in different ways to their own artistic practice. And so like it's sort of like a casual artistic practice, I think,
Mm-hmm.
was something it was like a matter of course growing up. Like of course you would be having something that you make, like, and I
Right.
think that just, I mean, almost like that set of assumptions has sort of like buoyed me in a
Right.
certain way.
Interesting. Um, so you've done a lot of self-producing, but you have had interactions with institutions. So how have institutions supported or not supported your work?
The experiences with institutions that I found most, helpful or sort of like mm, creating the possibility for like growth and movement in my work, have been relationships where there's sort of like a longer term residency.
Mm-hmm.
I guess when I'm thinking about like theater institutions in New York, like
Mm-hmm.
I was part of the HARP program and then also the New Ohio Theater, rest in peace's archive residency. So like these programs that are sort of built to help you move a project from like an early stage to a production stage over a period of years,
Mm-hmm.
I felt were very sort of like helpful for me in terms of like almost just like knowing, taking some variables off the table, like knowing, okay, this is going to happen then, and I do have people who are going to, it's not only going to be me
Right.
or only me and my collaborators trying to make it happen. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, and I think that like times that I felt like more frustrated with institutions, like I'll kind of like locate that at a certain time while I was in graduate school for playwriting, and like a little bit of the time after when I was maybe thinking more in that new play development world. Like I would feel really frustrated by the feeling of delay that I had as a
Yeah.
generative artist, where it would be like you'd write a play and then you'd send it somewhere, and it's just like it could be years before
Somebody writes
somebody
you
wanted
back.
to like pick it up. And I was sort of like coming from a place of like collaborative self-producing work. I was like, well, I just should do it. I mean, like I don't have the patience to sort of wait for a
Right.
particular kind of support if I feel like I can do it myself. And like, I mean, I think it's like that is someone from my particular background entering into that world, that's not most people's experience maybe, but I was thinking about like, it's like a balance, the sort of balance institutions work to strike between like offering something that's really bespoke for each artist, like um, and is really like meeting a particular artist or a particular project at its moment of need, which can be like unknowable at certain points or like wildly different from anything else, versus like legibility of like the an ecosystem of institutions. And by that I mean like I remember as a even still, but like especially as a younger artist, kind of looking around and being like, well, here are the kinds of opportunities or programs or whatever that artists who are a little further along than me are participating in, and just being able to kind of like think about like what are the moves that I would want to make in my career or like as my work develops, like feeling like there is some patterns or like roadmaps or something. um, uh, so I think that there's like a tension between those things in like how an institution might organize itself to support an artist. But I've also felt like in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, which has been such a turning over transformative time in this field, like the way that like some of those older patterns or roadmaps are kind of like washed away, and it's just like waiting to see like, well, what new maps emerge. And like, yeah, I mean, just it's sort of thinking about like what kind of ecosystem or like trajectory within an ecosystem would be desirable for not only for myself, but like for a younger artist, like moving through.
Totally. If you could change one thing about institutions, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be maybe just related to what I just said, like erring more on the side of the bespoke, or like to interrogate that balance between um, offering bespoke versus being legible about what an offering is to an artist. Like I
Yeah.
think that it's sometimes like that. That is the kind of thing that can serve as like a barrier to entry to people when it's just unclear,
Yeah.
like uh, what am I allowed to do? What do I need to do? What are the standards of
Yeah.
this particular thing? But like, um, yeah, I mean, I guess it's sort of almost like a communication thing, like how institutions are communicating with artists they want to support, and like the kind of support they're offering, but also like the clarity with which they are articulating what the support is.
Well, as a follow on to that, do you have a recommendation for how institutions can better support experimental practice or process rather than pushing towards like a commodification or pushing towards result?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like it's always amazing a kind of residency that to be offered a kind of residency that doesn't necessarily have like a um, articulated result that is expected at the end. Like, and it's like, I mean, I was almost gonna say like that doesn't even have a public component, but like I understand why that is needed sometimes. But just that it's like to be offered sort of like support where the container is clear, like you have this amount of weeks, you have this kind of space, these are the resources we offer, but that the outcome is sort of like, what do you need to do, what can you do with that will like push this process along for you. And I mean, I think that like places like Mercury Store, I think, are like, which is a residency center in New York that offers development space only for generative theater artists. Like I think that model is really useful because like that having that concentrated push towards something, I think it's more similar in certain ways to like residencies I've attended that are like maybe more traditional like writers residencies, where you're just going to work on a project, you have some time and resources to like do the work,
Yeah.
and there isn't a lot of sort of requirements around that, or sort of need to sort of prove that you're using it in the correct
Yes.
way or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Has access to resources changed your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like access to space has
Mm-hmm.
always been has changed my work like over, the time that I've been working in New York, in the ways that like availability of space has become different for artists, and like how I prioritize space has become different. Like when I started making work with NTUSA, it was in an era where or at least it was more common that you would be able to find someone who'd give you a storefront for a month or something to do. So like that was sort of built into the economy of like, well, we can probably get a space for free, and so how are we going to make the show happen with that? And like that kind of thing is much less possible now.
Yeah.
And you know, like I like prioritize having a studio space because I know over the years that is like the thing that sort of most helps me be generative. Like I need that
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. So that kind of resource has like my feeling about that resource and my orientation toward that resource has shifted, and it always like what the space is always patterns what the work is. But I think also the materials I'm working with, like what I have access to, or like the palette that I'm working with
Mm-hmm.
is changes what I do. And like I mean, just thinking about resources in terms of money, like for me, that is really mostly about people,
Mm-hmm.
like how you compensate collaborators, or like what kind of time you can expect from collaborators. And like, yeah, if you have more resources, there are different kinds of expectations you might have of collaborators based on the way that you're able to pay them. If you have less resources, you might have be striking a different balance. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that sort of can shift the like the way that you're setting a project up.
What's the relationship between place and performance for you? You talked a little bit about adjusting to different places. Is New York City one of your collaborators?
Yeah, I mean, well, like in that my work has pretty much all been in New York City. With
Mm-hmm.
the NGUSA work, we toured it a little bit in the United States and in Ireland, but like yeah, like the kinds of space that I am able to access to bring audiences into in New York, that I mean, like that has been like the pattern of so many
Mm-hmm.
things. And I think also, maybe underlying that is like a relationship to maybe what New York audiences expect from a professional theater, and what presenting something sort of different to those audiences is able to, like what that's able to create for them, and also for the artist, like how that allows you to kind of like change the experience, or like manage the experience in a different way. Like I think it's like you don't have sort of like a non-traditional use of space if you don't have a traditional use of space. So
Yeah. Do you think that the spirit of downtown that you entered into and you started is like late 90s,
it's
early
like early
2000s,
2000s,
early
yeah.
2000s? Do you think that that spirit still exists?
Yes, although I mean it's like obviously a pretty different kind of time. Like it's like a lot harder for people to make stuff. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that especially post pandemic is like really shows like how much of a struggle it is for people to just be here. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, for me, like I have a teaching job. It is a full-time teaching job, and that is like the thing that has sort of kept me stable for the last 15 years or something. And like I would not be able to do the kind of work I do without that other thing that I have going on in my life. And I think that that's like most people need to have something like that,
Mm-hmm.
to some other thing that's helping, or artists, I mean, that's helping them stay afloat, whether it's like a job, or like they have some inherited wealth, or they have that some particular angle, or
Right.
in order to make it happen. So like, and I think that was maybe
Or a rent stabilized
a rent
apartment
stabilized apartment. Like
like
they're
I
all,
have.
yeah, there are all
That's,
different ways that people like have a
yeah.
thing that sort of provides the amount of stability they need to kind of like be in a more precarious field. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that like my perception is that maybe there was like the barrier, or like there were things that were easier, 25 years ago, about creating that stability for yourself. But I think that like, one thing felt really heartened by this winter is the festival that the show I just presented was in is called Exponential. And I feel like this year I've been really, the spirit of that festival has been really great. And it's felt really like well curated. And by that I mean like a really great mix of like people who are more and less experienced. And but with like a vision or like an energy in the work. And
Yeah.
it's felt like community oriented in a way that I haven't really felt in kind of a while. And so that makes me feel like, yeah, I mean, it's like there's a spirit of sort of like experimentation and creating, unconventional work yourself that is like perennial. It's just like there are ways that it has been harder to access or harder for people to do that. And I felt like very heartened by the fact that that space feels like it's emerging as like, oh, this is a really good space for that. Like,
How do you define success as an artist, and has that idea or definition changed for you?
I mean, at core, I think it's still just like being able to keep doing my work, like, and like by, being able to have the time and the space to keep exploring. And yeah, like that, it's funny because that feels sort of like a static response, but for a long time that has felt like, well, that's when I know things are going really well, is when I have, when I have that sort of set up for myself. And like, I mean, it's like very exciting to be at the part of the process that's like the production is up and people are meeting it. And like, that is a lovely part. But like, I think I'm like, it's like the tech and like the making of it, like for me, are the parts where I'm really like, I mean, feeling the joy that you talked about. Like that's the sort of success, is like in making it and seeing it come together and sort of like create like, I think of it almost as like, it's like making a gift or something. Like, if you're making a gift for someone and you're like, they're really going to love this. They're going to, I mean, it's just like, it's that sort of moment in the process that I feel is the moment I'm like, I'm feeling successful.
That's beautiful. I remember during the pandemic, here we commissioned you to make a piece outdoors. And it was the first outdoor thing I think that happened in New York City post-pandemic. And well, we were still in it, but you came up with the ingenious idea of putting people into hoop skirts to have them be 6 feet apart. And when you say, it was a gift for them, like people loved so much putting on those hoop skirts, and they were so excited to be coming to live performance, and putting on the hoop skirt was part of what made them reclaim the joy of coming to performance. And you were giving them that gift. And it was really beautiful, to experience that with audiences every, for those few days that we did that show. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean that it's like be given like a weird new experience you didn't think you would have. Like
Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you'd want to share?
this is sort of apropos of an earlier question. One thing, an interesting thing that happened with the mushroom, which is something that I've been thinking through with my work and that has been like emergent in different ways, is the way that it's like the way that language works with something that's really visual. And like in that process, I mean, as with psychic self-defense, although in sort of a different way, we were working with a text for a really long time. In addition to the monologue, which opens the show, we were working with some different language and text for quite a while. And at a certain point, it was like, well, they need to not actually say that. And that it's like the value of the text was in the sort of process work.
Interesting.
And that it's like, I was like, that's a really, as a playwright, that's a really interesting way to think about like the value of the language.
The remnants are still there. They're still felt.
Totally. And it was like absolutely patterned, like the approach to how the performers did the performance, or like the characters they created. It was like, it was very formative, important to have it in the room for a really long time, but ultimately it needed to not be in the final show. And so like that, it's just, as I've been like meeting different moments like that, it's just interesting to me. Like for a long time, I felt like as a writer, what I really wanted to, when I was identifying more as a writer, I was like, what I really want to do though is like create a show that sort of proceeds from the visual, or like proceeds from design, and like doesn't take the text as like the central element. And it's been interesting to like in the last few shows sort of enact different ways of what that might mean, and like exciting actually. I'm like, that is an exciting use for language for me, that it's not about, and I think the reason that we wanted to take it out is that it's like once you're adding language to an experience that's really visual, it's like it changes the nature of that experience. And there's like, I feel like I'm playing around in the borders of like, well, what's possible and like what is that change? But like how and the way that it changes it is that it maybe, for my purposes, like sort of can have the potential to bring someone out of a different kind of like attention or absorption that they would have without interpreting language. And so yeah, I mean, I guess I've just been thinking about like how my interest with like creating that sort of space for people alongside my interest in creating language and like what language can do, and like thinking about how those two things, I feel like that's an open question for me, is like how
Yeah.
those two things are working together.
That's exciting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Thanks to you out there for joining us, and to Hal Round for hosting. And we hope you'll come back for more of Torches.